Hello, my friends. Welcome back to our live stream. We're here with Matthew Pose. How you doing, Matthew?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. It's been a while since we've done one of these live streams. I figured we should do a good one today and have you on, do some education about loudspeakers, about stacking speakers together. I want to talk about that. Before we begin, I want to thank you guys. We've been going crazy, obviously, with the last 6 weeks or so with the whole COVID thing. And I just want to thank everybody on YouTube that's given me personally so much support, as well as Audioholics to keep us going. As you guys know, we've lost a huge amount of revenue from advertising. And it's not just us, all the magazines have as well. What I didn't expect was all the incredible support from YouTube. And that GoFundMe thing just blew me away. I'm still responding to everybody's emails, every contributor is over 400 people, and I can't thank you guys enough. I mean, there was times when I was doing YouTube, and we talked about this, Matt. We're putting so much effort into YouTube, and it's like, how's it going to pay off for us? How's there going to be like an end game where we could sustain a business model to help supplement the Audioholics website? Well, after seeing how much love that you guys have given us, it makes me realize that what we're doing is worth it, and we're going to be offering membership services in the future, and we're going to be having more guest speakers on here as well. So YouTube is potentially the new future post COVID-19. We're going to be announcing new services. I'm going to be doing interviews with manufacturers. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on, and I'm taking YouTube more seriously. If you guys notice, I've been stepping up the content, and I plan to do more. So we got to get Matt committed to do more content, because everybody wants to hear from Matt.
Yeah, I need to get better about it. I've got all the great equipment now to do it, and just a lack of time. But yeah, I'm very excited about YouTube. I was when I started working for you originally, and I know that it had always been an issue that we just couldn't make YouTube a good part of the business model. It was a good way to reach people, which is what our goal is, but it wasn't earning enough money to cover the cost of doing it even. And I think that people showed us that one way or another, we have to make this work, and we appreciate it. I mean, when you lost that funding on advertising, it was killer. I mean, it was making it real hard to consider how we could move forward. And I think now we have good direction.
Yeah, and just so you guys know, we reached 2 million people in the last 28 days with 200,000 watch hours and 10,000 new subscribers. So we are kicking butt on YouTube. I want to give a shout out to Optimus Vader. He's been so kind to our channel. He's been doing the Patreon, the GoFundMe, as well as this $10 contribution here. Thank you, man. You're crazy good. You don't have to be that nice, but we love it. So let's get to the topic on hand. I want to show you guys what we were talking about. This actually was inspired by a personal thread I had on my Facebook that Doug Schneider from Soundstage commented on, and we were talking about speakers and flip stacking speakers. And it just got me to saying, you know what, Matt, you have the ability not only to simulate, but to measure this stuff. So why don't we talk about what this is, why you should not be doing this, what are the limitations of it? Because I peruse the Facebook groups often, and I peruse the audio forums, and I see people either flip stacking speakers like this, or they put speakers side by side and they run them in stereo. So I want to talk to you about what the acoustical problems of doing those kind of things, whether it's comb filtering or acoustical interference. So Matt was kind enough to put together this PowerPoint presentation, and we'll just kind of go over it, and I'll give him the lead on many of these topics.
Yeah, and I think we'll get into it with this presentation, but I think folks need to know that when we do these, it's not like you and I are just sitting around talking. There's work that goes into putting these presentations on. So in this particular case, there was two things that I did for you to make this as educational as possible for everybody, but also believable, because we know that this is a common enough practice that if we don't show you what's really going on, we know some of you won't believe us. So the first thing I did was, using real measurement data on raw speaker drivers, I modeled a fictitious speaker that was in the example of, for instance, like what you see in this picture. I didn't model this exact speaker, but something kind of like that concept. And then I modeled it as a more standard mid-range tweeter, mid-range type or MTM type speaker to show you the difference between those. But then I know that a lot of you would probably say, well, but how accurate are models? I want to see the real thing because it sounds fine. And so I actually measured a pair of bookshelves that I stacked in order to show people, what that would look like. So it took hours to do all of this.
Yeah, I
Excuse me.
appreciate that, Matt.
Yeah, and you and I had a lot of back and forth, and so I just want everybody to know that like we're not coming to you with some theory or we don't believe it, but we don't have any proof, and you've heard it and it's good. I get that. We actually have proof though of what it's doing, and why it's problematic.
I'll tell you the one cool thing I like about this picture, the speakers. Number one, I grew up with Cerwin Vegas. When I was in high school, I had a pair of DX or D2s. My brother had a pair of D3s, the old digital series, and I got into the AT15. So I'm not bashing Cerwin Vega. I loved Cerwin Vega when I was in high school, especially the bass you got out of them, the red surrounds. But I love these pull-up bars, man. You could actually, after you do your listening, you could do some pull-ups. I think this is a really cool looking speaker.
Well, I recognize this. This is, I can't remember the model number. You might know it or somebody on here does, but I remember this model from when I was a kid. I wanted this model. I didn't have it. There was an Infinity model and the Cerwin Vega that looked pretty similar in setup, and I liked both of them quite a bit. And what it looks like is somebody took 4 of them, 2 pairs, and as we've called it, flip stacked them, but actually built a custom enclosure to hold everything. So I would say this particular example was probably an acoustic nightmare beyond belief.
Yeah. And no offense to the person that owns it. If you enjoy it, if you're watching this podcast, we're just trying to go over the science of loudspeakers. If you like something that measures badly, that's fine. I mean, that's no biggie.
So, by the way, this picture that you see here is not a flip stack speaker. It's called an expanding array. So what is flip stacking? So it's just the idea of taking 2 pairs of speakers. It could be a bookshelf, it could be a tower, flipping one of them upside down and putting it on top of the other one. So what you saw in that first picture really was probably a better example of what a flip stack speaker would look like. Yeah. And you gain 3 decibels roughly of sensitivity from doing this, but you also double the power handling. So for all practical purposes, you're getting basically at least 6 decibels of extra output from each one of these speakers. And so the system becomes quite a bit louder. Now, one of the other arguments for doing it, besides getting louder and increasing dynamic range, is that you're adding some vertical directivity control by doing this. And we're going to go into how that's both true and not really true.
So you would say ceiling reflections, but also it would be floor reflections too, no?
It'd be potentially eliminating some of the ceiling and floor reflections if it worked right. Yes. And there are ways to achieve the same vertical directivity control, but with a better behaved system, which is basically designing one to be like that. So this is the Atlantic, I forget the model number, but it's the new
8600E, I believe.
Sounds good. It's the new top of the line Atlantic technology speaker. It's, I believe, THX rated, and it's a woofer, mid-range tweeter, mid-range woofer setup. It's actually woofer, mid-range tweeter, mid-range woofer. So this thing is a beast of a speaker, and the benefit of this design is very high dynamic range, but also good vertical directivity control. So it reduces basically the level of the reflection off of the ceiling and the floor, which can improve sound in the room.
So you're actually increasing the modal density at bass frequencies by having 2 bass drivers by the floor and then 2 seemingly towards the ceiling, depending on how tall your ceiling is. You can have better control of vertical room modes with a speaker like this, as opposed to just having the 2 bass drivers on the floor.
Sure. Yep.
So anyways, and this is just a conventional MTM that we always talk about. So I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that. 2 mids and a tweeter.
Basically, yep. So I wanted to show you guys a theoretical arrangement, because the nice thing about a theoretical arrangement is that I can play around with the specifics of the design in lots of different ways in order to optimize it or not, in order to show you what happens. And what I didn't want you guys to do is to say, well, okay, Matt, so just flipping a pair of bookshelves on top of each other measures bad, but what if you have DSP and you can like design the crossover for that purpose? Well, my model allowed me to do that. And I just realized, Gene, that we're flipping through the slides, but you're not actually showing it full screen. If you play the slideshow, it'll make the slide bigger for people.
Oh, I'm sorry about that, man. That's bad on me. Let me go. Where do I do that
at the top here? There should be a play from current slide. So, yep, right there.
Right here. That was dumb. Right. Now, it's been so long since we've done this. I forgot.
I know we got out of practice on this. So anyway, what I decided to do was to use the Dayton Audio 4-inch RS100. It's a full range driver, but you can use it as a mid range, as I did. And there's a ND25, I believe it is, titanium dome tweeter. These from Dayton, and so I had measurement data from them for these drivers that I could use in my models, which included some off-axis data to show you what's going on. And then I spaced the drivers basically so that it best mimicked what would happen if you were to create a 4-inch two-way bookshelf and then stack them on top of each other with the kind of expected spacing you would get between the tweeter on the top of the enclosure of each speaker, which would cause too big of a gap between the tweeters. Basically, it's one of the problems with the flip stacking approach and then the next tweeter. So basically, I put in the correct amount of spacing to show that. And then the crossover was actually optimized for this arrangement. So it was not just like a standard two-way bookshelf that I doubled up. I actually designed the crossover as if this was something that you would be producing this way to better mimic what a produced speaker would be. And I used an LR6 design, so it was a very steep crossover, and there was quite a bit of EQ to help flatten the response. So we can.
So you did a lot of optimization that someone at home that takes 2 pairs of speakers and flip stacks is not.
Yeah, this is beyond that. This is more like what probably somebody producing a speaker would do.
Right. And now, so, what program did you use to do this? Just curiosity.
It's called. I think I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but Vituix CAD 2. It's
okay,
a crossover modeling.
It's a pretty sophisticated.
It is actually pretty sophisticated, but it's free. So I mean, anybody who understands crossover design can go there, and it's got quite a bit of capabilities, including that it can fully model what the spinorama chart should look like. So you can design a speaker to optimize the spinorama data as well. Okay. So the nice thing about that is we get to see what the spinorama data would look like in theory, at least with the speaker. So, all right, we can go to the next one. So there you go. There's the spinorama data. Now I didn't have enough measurements included in my data points to correctly create spinorama. So this is sort of a, we'll call it a pseudo spinorama. It's a little bit off, but the top shows you the flip stacked mid-range tweeter, mid-range design, and the bottom one shows you the MTM, the mid-range tweeter, mid-range design. And what you can see is that actually, based on this alone and nothing else, the flip stack looks pretty good. In fact, it looks maybe even a little bit better than the regular MTM. And the reason for that in this particular case was, as I said, I optimized it as much as possible and was able to take advantage of the fact that the double tweeters were able to have a little bit better dispersion, a little bit less beaming at the highest frequencies. And so that's what caused that improvement. Now, actually, a little bit lower in the directivity index area, that's that red line on the bottom of each chart, you can see that they look very similar to each other, and maybe even the MTM is slightly better, kind of hard to say. What you see with the MTM that's interesting is that it seems like the directivity index stays raised down lower in frequency. Yeah. So we're going to see why in a minute, though, that we see this very slight difference. There's actually something else going on that you can't see in this particular chart that's pretty significant.
Okay, but so far I'm team flip stack.
It looks, yeah. So based on this, you would think it's all good.
Right. Okay, let's go on and see what goes on after this.
All right, so then here's the horizontal dispersion. This is why it looks good, because fully optimized, this particular flip stacked setup that I created measures very good horizontally. I mean, if we reviewed a speaker that measured that well, we'd be very happy with that.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, this is a marketable speaker. Now let's go to the next one, though. Okay, that doesn't look so good.
No.
So this is the vertical directivity. So the vertical directivity of an MTM always tends to look a lot worse than the horizontal dispersion. The vertical directivity of most speakers, we were talking about this earlier, tends to look worse than the horizontal because of the layout. But MTMs have a lobing problem. So let's look at the bottom graph first. The lobing.
So vertical, guys, just so step back, vertical's up and down.
Right.
We did before horizontal was side by side.
Exactly. So if we look at the bottom one, which is not the flip stack, but the MTM, what you can see is the lobing problem we talk about with MTMs. And that's where the directivity doesn't really match. There's this area where the directivity is widening in the area between around 800 hertz, maybe a little bit lower than that, maybe even like actually 600-700 hertz on up to around 3 kilohertz. And that's caused by the drivers being arranged over each other, helping to reduce the dispersion of the speaker in that vertical. And then at some point, the woofers aren't really a part of the equation anymore. It's just the tweeter, and then it's the natural directivity of the tweeter. And this was as optimized as I could get it with reasonable spacing between the drivers. And the spacing plays a big role in how well optimized this could be. Again, if we measured a speaker that measured like that bottom one, we would call that a very good speaker. But if you look at the top one, the on-axis response looks about the same. I mean, it is basically identical to that of the MTM. And then every single other angle has broken down into basically lobes and nulls, and that's all you see. So there is no other angle, not even 10 degrees, that looks anything like the on-axis. So
to translate that to English, just sitting down, if you find one spot where this speaker measures good on axis and your ears are aligned perfectly, it'll sound okay. But if you move up or down 10 degrees, which isn't much, you're going to hear major changes in the frequency response of the speaker.
Exactly. So it's really bad, basically, even a little bit off. And it causes another problem. So not only does the response get really bad as you move up a little bit or down a little bit, but also the reflections, which are part of how we perceive sound in a room, are really bad. And so the frequency response of those reflections have gotten really bad. So ceiling reflections, for instance, are a part of how we perceive space, for instance, in a recording. And unless you can fully absorb those, which typically you can't, those are going to be something you are hearing and perceiving. And as I said, the frequency response of those has changed. And so you'll hear that. This will all become part of the audible distortions, if you will, of the speaker. So the response has really become pretty bad as a result of doing this stacking.
So in other words, when you're listening, let's say you had that perfect spot where you had the on-axis response that was smooth, right? You're not getting the summed response from the reflections from the ceilings and the floor that look like that. They look radically different. So when they try to integrate back into your ears, that's not going to be very beneficial. Like a speaker that has good on and off axis response when it integrates those reflections back.
Yeah, basically, yes, what you said is correct. And so, and I see some people are commenting that they made it work. And I would just say this, unless you've got measurements like we did, it's hard to say that it worked, because one of the things about the lobing artifacts is that they tend to be, especially at high frequencies, pretty high Q. So they're audible, but they're not audible in the way you would expect. They don't sound like tonal colorations. Now, the other ones that you can see below about 3 kilohertz, those in this particular example are pretty substantial and pretty bad. I would be shocked if those are not audible as an actual tonal shift. Given that, I mean, you can see in the blue line that's in that top one there's like a whole section of the mid range that's completely missing. That's
a very large Q right there. That's definitely audible.
Yeah. So
what else?
Yep, we can go to the next. Yep, we can go on. All right, so this is the polar map, and this is what it looks like. So what you guys have seen us show these kinds of polar maps before with MTMs, and they always look, I always describe them as like abstract art. They look pretty, but that prettiness is not a good thing. So essentially what you're seeing is a speaker that has extremely narrow dispersion in which the response is good, and everywhere off of that has become really bad. So the response looks really good, basically, as I said before, at 0 degrees and nowhere else. And that's what that's showing. And it's also showing that it's not consistent, that essentially the response is changing. And that's that pattern you saw. So this is not good. Okay. So
now you took some Martin Logans that you had that you recently reviewed.
Right, exactly. So I took some Martin Logans that I had and that we had reviewed, and I stacked them essentially on the floor. And this is just a better way of measuring in a room in order to see what's going on as you lay them on the floor pointing up at the ceiling. And this helps to maximize the distance between the speakers and any of the boundaries. And then you put the mic basically pointed down at the speaker over it and do some measurements. So I did that in this particular setup, which allowed me to ensure that they were properly placed together. And the measurements are basically valid above 200 hertz.
Well, how far was the mic from the speaker? About 2 meters or 1 meter or what?
A meter. There wasn't enough room in here to do 2 meters. But
okay.
Given that it was a small bookshelf, I think the 1 meter was fine. Yeah. I tried different distances just to see it didn't change things. So here you can see what happened. So this, I mean, I didn't show you what it looks like correctly, but if you go back to our review, you can see that the Martin Logan has a pretty smooth response. It doesn't look anything like this. So basically this screwed the response up pretty bad, and you can see in real life what happened.
So it really was a real measurement. This is not a simulation.
Yeah. No, this is a real measurement. Yeah, it doesn't look good. Okay, so then we can go ahead to the next one. And this shows you out at the more extreme angles what the response looks like. Basically just playing one speaker versus two. And you can see at 30 degrees out, the difference between that top one there, the difference is pretty bad. You can see that there's a dip that's forming. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that whenever two were playing in real life, there was an interference with the tweeters that you couldn't get rid of. So I think in this particular case, probably this was partly to do with the fact that it was using that particular kind of accordion style tweeter that's larger than a normal dome tweeter. So in and of themselves, they tend to sometimes have some interference across the top of them.
Mm-hmm.
And in this particular case, I think because we had two of them placed the way we did, it was making this problem worse so that it was showing up in the horizontal and in the vertical. So this is actually the horizontal plane, not the vertical plane. And what you can see is that there's a dip in the high frequencies above 10 kilohertz. It moves with angle, and it's screwing up the very high frequencies.
Which is bad if you have a theater room where you have multiple seats. If you go from side to side, unless you're in that money seat, a speaker like this won't work. It's very similar to how if you see, and nobody really does this anymore, when you have a center channel with tweeters on opposing sides and you have mid-ranges in the middle, that's just a bad center channel design. That's only good for one seat. That's it.
Right. Yeah, you can have these problems. So, okay, so then we can go on to the next slide. So here's the example that, of course, set this off. And I'm going to say it's questionable, not bad, because certainly there's ways to optimize this. And we know that the company that did this has really good amplifiers. They have a good DSP platform, and they've put a lot of effort into it. And we've never measured them. So I don't know how they measure. This was just more of an experiment of the concept that's being used here to show that it can be problematic. And definitely just taking off-the-shelf speakers, flipping them over, connecting them together in parallel or series, hooking them up to your amp and hoping for the best is probably going to lead to results that look more like what you saw here than what you would ideally want with a good speaker. But
especially those mid ranges are so far apart too.
Well, and that's another issue. So there are ways to do expanding array speakers like this that are optimized, that perform well and have good measurements. So I don't want to suggest that having lots of drivers in an MTM type arrangement is somehow always bad. It's not. It's fine. It's that when you design a speaker to be, let's say, a tower, and then you simply stick two of them on top of each other, the problem you have is that the drivers are no longer optimized in terms of their distances apart. And so what can happen is that the tweeters for sure tend to be too far apart. And that causes a lot of these lobing problems, which extend, as you saw, all the way down to the crossover point. But then the mid-ranges often are still a little bit too far apart as well, given the crossover points that you end up choosing for what would have been normally just a regular tower. And it further exacerbates that problem so that you'll have this problem all the way down to like 500-600 hertz. And that's what we saw in my model. And that's also what we saw in my real world measurements. So it's really difficult to do this right if you don't actually design the speaker with this intent in the first place.
Right. So in other words, this should be a custom designed speaker, not just taking two speakers, which the speakers by themselves might be a good speaker, if it's just a single speaker. But then if you take another one and flip it over and do this, you're going to run into some issues.
Yeah, there's a good chance of it. So then the other issue is that the double tweeter. So again, you can have arrays of tweeters, but we were talking to Shane Rich earlier about this. So RBH had done that in the past, and there's advantages to using multiple tweeters like that. It dramatically expands the dynamic range, which is a good thing. It can reduce distortion. That's a good thing. It can add vertical directivity control if you can make it work. The problem is it's really hard to make work right.
Especially in the analog domain, right?
Yeah. And so he gave up on the idea, as we know. And I was playing around with it for this project, and I've played around with it in the past, and I've always found it to be fairly hard to get right as well. Dyne Audio did it in their high-end speakers and made it work pretty well, but they did that actually by making it so that the upper tweeter only covered a very narrow bandwidth. It was crossed over at 3 kilohertz and 8 kilohertz, so that it was covering less of a range than the lower tweeter. And that was part of how they reduced the interference. And then there was some shading too, reduction in level.
I think Sony does that too with their ES line of speakers. They have like two tweeters, that one's like almost a super tweeter, and then the other one is...
Yeah, I think that's a little different because I think it's actually a super tweeter. So I think it's actually operating only at the uppermost range, and that's done for a different reason, which is that tweeters beam. So if you use a smaller super tweeter, you can expand the directivity at the highest of frequencies.
Oh, okay, I got you.
But anyway, in this particular case, the point I'm trying to make is that there's difficulty in getting those tweeters to work right when you do the way I'm describing. And if you look at things like Bessel arrays, which are one of the better ways of doing multiple tweeters, Bessel arrays typically require that you work with odd numbers. They don't have to, but they don't work with 2. You can't do a Bessel array with 2. Gotcha. So typical Bessel arrays, though, are odd numbers, and there is an even number version of the Bessel array approach, but it's getting it optimized and set up right is hard. Shane was saying he just couldn't get it to work and gave up on it. I've had trouble with them in the past, so there's an argument to be made that the multiple tweeter array like this is just problematic, and that there's maybe better approaches.
Mm-hmm. Maybe using a horn or using a driver that has more dynamic capability, something like that, a single driver.
Yeah, and the main point that we're making, yes, that's right. And the main point we're making with this overall is that multiple array drivers like this, but suboptimally set up, leads to pretty severe comb filtering, and that's not a good thing.
Right. So what is comb filtering, and is it audible?
Yeah, well, so one of the arguments against all this is that comb filtering is not audible, so who cares? And the answer to that is really a little bit more complex, but really it is audible. So there are significant numbers of studies which have found comb filtering artifacts to be quite audible, as long as the reflections that are causing them are within what's called the integration zone, which tends to be the first 30 milliseconds. So I sent you, what was it, like 3 or 4 studies, took 30 seconds to find them, all said exactly the same thing. These were experimental studies where they created comb filtering and they did threshold tests and found that it was readily audible. So comb filtering is absolutely audible as long as what's causing that artifact falls within the integration zone. The comb filtering that's caused by reflections off of sidewalls or 2 speakers that are substantially separated from each other, such as the center image that you get from a stereo pair, is less audible because the brain can actually discern the reflections that are causing that from the direct sound. And so the brain doesn't really pick up the comb filtering. But the comb filtering that's caused by a speaker array is happening local to the front of the speaker. It is so short in time that the brain has no way of being able to separate the direct sound from the reflected sound. The timing differences are way too small. The angle differences are too small. And the problem in this case is in the vertical, which is we have a lot less angular resolution vertically. So comb filtering caused by a speaker array is audible, and there's no way for the brain to be able to discern that.
So technically, you should really call excuse me. Technically, you should really call that acoustical interference when you're talking about an array of drivers that are co-located on that speaker, as opposed to having 2 different speakers on opposite sides of the room.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Now, there's a bunch of people here who have been talking about the old M&Ks with the dual mid-bass drivers and the triple tweeters, yep. And they're asking about those and how that worked. So I want to say again, we're not saying that multiple speakers put together can't work. We're saying that when it's done suboptimally, such as what happened when you simply stack some speakers together, it doesn't tend to work well. Now, M&K, I actually have to be honest, I've never seen full measurements on the M&K speakers. So it's possible that when you get off into the vertical extremes that there is some comb filtering problems. I know that they had foam on their speakers that they put between those tweeters, which I would guess was probably to help reduce some of the very high frequency comb filtering that was happening from interference right that would have been between those. And so they probably took some efforts to reduce that. But the other part of it is that those tweeters were designed to be right up next to each other. They were very close together. And by doing that, it made it so that you would be able to reduce those problems that I'm talking about. They may also, I don't know how their crossovers worked. I have never actually seen a schematic for one of the crossovers for that particular line of speakers. So it's also possible that they were doing something with the crossover to help optimize it, which would have been different than a flip stack speaker like we're talking about here.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right. So the other thing that people often, I think, confuse is they say, well, isn't flip stacking like a line array, and aren't line arrays okay? And so the answer is that flip stacking is not a line array. It's really an expanding array. Expanding array means that as the wavelengths get larger, the drivers themselves physically get larger out into the vertical. So expanding array meaning that you're expanding out in physical size as you get into lower frequencies. So this is a picture of a line array, which is not what we've been showing pictures of and not what we're talking about. This is a Macintosh line array. So line arrays typically have drivers that would ideally go floor to ceiling or as close to it as possible. And they do this because they're trying to create a planar wave. Expanding arrays do not create planar waves. They work differently. And flip stacking, as I said, really creates that. So shading is often done with line arrays. Now, a straight line array actually doesn't have a very good frequency response. And it's one of the problems with straight line arrays. So shading is used, including in those pro audio installations that you see, in order to help reduce some of those problems.
What is shading?
You asked me to define that. So shading or amplitude shading refers to changing of the level of the drivers as you move out to the extremes, the top and the bottom. So what that means is that when you design the crossover, you make it so that as you move to the outer drivers at the top and bottom, the level is progressively reduced. And this helps reduce the interference.
So it's only reduced in level, but the frequency response is common between all the drivers, right? All the tweeters share the same bandwidth. All the little mids share the same bandwidth.
Yeah, and I see Don keeps mentioning the use of the multiple tweeters in the M&K. I actually believe that not only was it done for vertical dispersion, I think it was also done for output. The reality is a single 1-inch dome tweeter can't reach THX reference levels, especially back when those were first designed. They just weren't capable of it. And so the only way to do it with sufficiently low distortion was to use 3 of them.
And I've heard those. I've heard those speakers in many demos. Denon used to use them in their CD demos to do the 5805. It was a good speaker. I mean, I don't think it was a particularly musical speaker as much as it was for like theater. I mean, it sounded. We did a lot of demos for movie theater kind of demos, and there was tons of dynamic range from those little speakers as long as you had a bunch of subs in the room. Which
makes sense given the design. Yeah, I would expect them to be able to play pretty loud. Yeah. So we can, I think there's more slides. We can go to the next one. All right. So this point was getting made constantly where people were like, what about this speaker? What about that speaker? Well, I know.
I told you to put a bunch of different examples. That's why I kept pushing you.
So here's the Dynaudios, the Tectonics. A lot of people have seen that tweeter array in the Tectonics and so that can't work. That thing must be awful. Now, I've only seen the stereophile measurements of the bookshelf version, which uses that. It's basically the top half of that speaker. And what I can say is that John Atkinson's measurements were some of the best I've seen of any speaker. Like they were impressive in general. There was some slight issues that I would suggest that it's not completely perfect, but it worked really well. So I would say that the designer of that speaker, as much as I think his marketing is crazy, I think his speakers are well designed and that tweeter array is actually a really good one. He does not call it a Bessel array. Most of us in the industry have come to call it a Bessel array. Whether that is exactly what it is or not, I don't know. He hasn't made his crossovers public, but I've heard these speakers a number of times and I find them impressive. I'm hoping that actually we can get a set of the larger towers. I don't want to deal with them. So I'm just going to say that before people start putting us into expectations around this, but I would love to get the biggest version he has, which uses 2 of those tweeter arrays connected together somehow. I just want to see how it measures because it doesn't look like it should measure well, but everything else he's made does measure pretty well. And so I have
Matt, you're a sucker for getting the largest speakers in for review. So I think you have to have James Larson come and help you out with that as well.
James warned me too. He said, don't get into doing that. You don't want to, but it's like, who doesn't dream of playing around with big speakers? The problem is once you got them, they're such a pain to have to deal with, and measuring them is extremely difficult.
Yeah, definitely.
But the point of all this is you can put multiple speakers together into an array like this, and you can get very good measured performance. We're not saying that's bad. We're saying simply taking a couple of towers or bookshelves, flipping one of them over, sticking it on top and hoping for the best is probably not a good idea. And you'll get the results that we showed here.
So the Dynaudio example that you're showing with the 2 tweeters, that's the one where they're doing the limited bandwidth on the top tweeter or the bottom tweeter, or are they sharing the same bandwidth?
Yeah, so the bottom tweeter is operating full bandwidth. I believe it's 3 kilohertz to, whatever the top end is, let's say 20 kilohertz. The top one is 3 kilohertz, but it's only up to 8 kilohertz.
Okay.
So it's a different, it's operating over a lower
and
bandwidth.
They're very closely spaced together too.
Yeah, in fact, what they had to do was it's their EsoTar tweeter, which is their top of the line tweeter. And it's a very high quality dome tweeter. And it normally comes with a big, I think it's like a 3 or 4 inch, might even be bigger than that, faceplate. And they had to actually make a custom faceplate and stick the driver and motor, which I believe had to be kind of customized to fit together so it could be that close together. So they had to OEMs. I mean, they are an OEM, but they had to OEM stuff to make this work, meaning that we couldn't do that with their products. I couldn't take their regular bookshelves and stick them on top of each other and get the same result.
Right, absolutely. And I think that's it.
Yeah, that looks like
for the slide presentation at least. All right, let me zoom back in. So, I don't know. I mean, I think that was pretty thorough. I think the flip stacking idea is really not necessarily a sound one, especially if it's not engineered to do that. And I think that's still, even if you think you're engineering it, I think you're still dealing with physical spacing of the drivers being a problem, mostly with the tweeters. If you don't get those tweeters close together, you're just asking for problems that you don't really need to have.
Yeah, well, and there's a couple of things. So I think with some questions we should answer related to this. So John Fielding has asked a couple of questions around different options for this and what is or isn't okay. So he's saying, are we just saying don't stack it? I mean, I will say this. I kind of question that Bryston speaker. I'm not going to say that I think it's bad because I've never seen measurements and I'd have to see those to feel confident. But in general, I think even a manufactured speaker where you're stacking the tweeters the way they have, where there's too much space between the inner set. I mean, that spacing alone always causes a problem. DSP can't fix that. That's why you want to usually try to get those as close together. But he may have, it may work. I don't want to say it doesn't because I've never seen measurements and I've never even seen or heard them in person.
So this is something you should talk about, Matt, because I don't think some people realize the lengths we go through to measure loudspeakers, even though we don't have an anechoic chamber.
Yeah, you don't need an anechoic chamber to measure properly. There's a number of ways that you can measure things correctly. So an anechoic chamber means reflection free. If you take a speaker outside, it is also reflection free off of everything but the ground. And what that means is that at high frequencies all the way down to about 150 hertz at the height that we measure at, you don't have any reflection. So it's the same as an anechoic chamber. And actually, not only do many manufacturers do that who don't have anechoic chambers, but before anechoic chambers were common, that was what the standard approach was. Now our approach has been validated against anechoic chamber measurements. So we've had at least 2 speakers. Well, we've had hundreds of speakers at this point that we've measured that were previously measured in anechoic chambers where the measurements were verified by the manufacturer. But we've actually had measurements for 2 speakers where that exact speaker was measured in an anechoic chamber, sent to us, we measured it, and then they sent us their results so we can compare. So James did that with a speaker, I think it was an Infinity.
The Revels, no?
Maybe it was the Revel. Well, he did it recently with the Revels, but
okay.
Previous Infinities, a long while back, he did that to validate his approach. And then I copied his approach. I mean, he lives near me, so I copied his approach in order for us to be consistent with each other. I used different equipment, but the same concept. And then I had a pair of PSBs that were measured in that way. They were measured at the NRC. That exact pair was sent to me. I measured them, and everything was consistent, very, very consistent, actually.
Got you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the other thing I was going to say is, so when we do other approaches, like when I lay it on the ground, I can validate my ground measurement against my up in the air measurement to know that that's right without having to go back to an anechoic chamber.
Yep. So Don asks us an interesting question too. Do you feel like there'd be any negative coloration between 2 cabinets interacting? And I could personally say absolutely that's a concern, because if you look at what RBH did with the SVTRS system that I have now, they have like a pretty thick layer of felt between the cabinets. So when you stack them, they're doing just that. They're trying to eliminate any type of resonances between the cabinets. And you want to have a really good seal between them when they join together.
Yeah, there's actually lots of potential issues you can have with multiple cabinets in a room. And to some extent with a surround system, you're not going to get away with not having multiple cabinets in a room. But when you have ported speakers in a room, the ported speaker can actually act as a kind of Helmholtz resonator in and of itself. And so if you have spread all around the room and they're like little surround speakers versus your mains or something, probably not a huge issue. But if you've got, like you were showing me pictures, Gene, of people who look like they had like Serwin Vega collections or something. There was just like 20 of them sitting there in the front of the room. There's so many of them right next to each other that those would interact with each other and potentially resonate. So there can be issues like that. Yeah.
So Can Do just sent us $20. I appreciate it. He left a little note saying, glad to see you recovered. Thank you. I am glad as well. I'm looking forward to being back with my family. It's been 35 days or so since I've been in isolation. So hopefully this week I can finally be back.
Yeah, it is good. I see John Lane says not to stack subwoofers. So I just want to mention there is potential reasons for stacking subwoofers. Even in pro audio, it's done sometimes. So you can create a base array and it can control at low frequencies directivity. In a room, you can't do this outside, but in a room, there's something you can do, which some people choose to do on purpose, which is that if you get a floor to ceiling stack of subwoofers, you create a planar wave. So when you create a planar wave, instead of it having a spherical shape, it has a planar shape, which can be best described as kind of like, let's say, bowing out from the floor to the ceiling instead of having like ripples or, as I said, a spherical shape that kind of goes out from the center. What that means is there's no longer a vertical mode. So if you create a planar wave at low frequencies, there's no longer a reflection off of the floor and ceiling, and there's no longer any vertical modes. Not only are there no vertical modes, there's also no vertical boundary interference effects. The so ceiling
SBIR.
SBIR, right.
Yeah.
So there's good reason to do that. It gets rid of those reflections.
Yeah.
The reason against doing that is that if you actually completely eliminate all low frequency reflections in a room, it's the same as what's referred to as like free space bass or outdoor bass. So the negative of that is that isn't what we're used to hearing in a room. And so it's kind of like listening in an anechoic chamber at low frequencies.
Right. So one thing I think it's important is sometimes people get kind of hung up on more is better when in actuality less could be more. So don't just start stacking speakers vertically or horizontally just because you want more output or you think it's cool that you have vintage speakers laying around. If you care about fidelity, if you care about accurate reproduction, and you want everybody that's in your room to actually hear the same thing you're hearing and not have all these different frequency aberrations, it's not a good idea to do that generally.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about what it takes to get the best fidelity. If you're just playing around and you're having fun and it sounds good to you, that's fine. Do whatever you want. But if you're trying to go after the best fidelity, that tends to hurt fidelity. And if your problem is that you don't have enough output and that's affecting your perception of good sound, it's just not loud enough. And Gene, you and I are similar in this. We like big speakers. We like things that are very dynamic. The reality is you have to get a designed speaker that's more dynamic. So something that's already intended to be like that.
Yeah. So this is a question about the new speakers that I'm reviewing, the SVTRS. This is not a flip stack speaker. This is a completely different speaker. The only thing that's stacked really are the bass modules, which is okay to do, like you said before. What it does is control in vertical room modes. But Matt, maybe you want to talk a little bit about the spacing on the mid-range drivers and how that works.
Yeah, well, so that basically is a giant bookshelf, if we want to call it, in the middle, stacked between two giant subwoofers. That center one was designed and engineered to be the way it is. And it uses a very long folded motion, that accordion style tweeter. So that's the largest one I think that's made of that.
2x6, I believe.
Yeah, so it's a big tweeter that itself is actually kind of self-controlling vertical directivity. And then around it is a C shape of 8-inch mid-range drivers. So a lot of people have looked at that and said that can't possibly work. Now, Gene, you and I have seen Shane's measurements, so we know that at least the on-axis measurements look really exceptional. Now, I showed you can have good on-axis and bad off-axis, so you and I are curious ourselves to see exactly how that measures. But there is a conceptual difference between that and the flip stack. So those 8-inch drivers are very close together. They're basically touching each other. They are crossed relatively low because that whatever it is, 2x6 tweeter. That tweeter is able to play lower than a 1-inch dome tweeter really ever could. And so by crossing it over low, that allows you to get away with it. Basically, the lower the crossover point, the farther apart they can be without creating these interference problems. Yeah. So this is my guess, because I haven't seen that speaker measured yet. And actually, I'm going to get one of them to measure. So my guess would be that the speaker is going to have probably some issues, some lobing issues in the vertical domain, but nothing worse than any normal MTM, probably better. My guess is it's actually going to measure better than typical MTMs. but there's probably going to be a little bit of problems, nothing that we would consider like overly bad. And then what it's going to have is probably pretty wide dispersion towards the inside of the room and more controlled, narrower dispersion to the outside because of that arrangement of the mid-range being next to the tweeter. That's what that typically would do.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I hear now, because I had the Status ATs, which had a conventional MTM design. And what I noticed with the SVTRS system is you get that same kind of precision when you're in your seating area, and your vertical modes are the same. You don't get vertical lobing like you would with a multi-tweeter array. But when you get outside of that speaker, and if you're sitting on the side of the room, you definitely hear less of that speaker or less of the higher frequencies than you would with a conventional kind of design.
Right. So I'm excited to get these and measure them so that we can show everybody what they actually measure like, good or bad. If they measure great, then great, we can see. And if they don't, I think Shane's going to want to know that, and we'll work with him to, the nice thing about that design is that because it is it's a DSP system where like every single speaker is individually powered, basically, you can do like a ton to optimize the measurements on it. But so everybody knows, we're going to be getting, those speakers are huge and they're hard to measure the way they're designed. So what I'm going to do is actually get that middle module and one of the base modules, but not two. I hope not two. And I'm going to take
you like bass. Come on.
I love bass. I don't want to have to deal with those two subs though. I have a new baby on the way, and it's going to be a lot. Yeah. So the middle module, I'm going to stick up about 7 feet in the air, and I'm going to measure it on a turntable. So it's going to spin, every 5 degrees, I'll take measurements, and that'll give us the full horizontal. And then I'll move the I have a custom microphone stand, and I'm going to move that up and down to get the up and down across around a 90-degree arc. That'll give us everything we need for Spinorama down to the lower end of that speaker, which actually operates down to about 100 hertz, I believe. And then the bass module I'm going to get as well. We're not going to stick that up on the tower, and you don't need to because
we already have ground plane measurements of that bass module anyways.
We do, but I'll measure it again, and we'll actually probably stick the stack together, if you will, just to check integration. But we'll do that on the ground to do that in order to get accurate measurements at those low frequencies.
You should definitely do a video on this to show everybody, because Matt and James are like the workhorse of Audioholics, man. They go outside in the field, they go through sweat, they go through the weather, the rain, the wind, you name it. They lift the heavy products up on these platforms, and it's awesome that you guys are willing to do this, and you guys are that obsessed with loudspeakers.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, someone keeps saying that my RBH speakers are stacked. They're not stacked arrays. I'm hoping that after this presentation, now you guys finally see the difference. This was a specifically designed speaker with 2 very closely spaced mid-ranges. We're talking about the ATs with a tweeter in the middle, then 2 more mid-ranges. It's just an MTM. It wasn't taking 2 speakers and flipping them and putting them together.
Right. Yeah, it's a different thing. Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking about being the workhorses. I don't think everybody fully appreciates what it takes to measure this stuff. So somebody mentioned JTR, and of course we're friends with Jeff, and I know JTR speakers very well. And I measured the 212. I need to get that review posted. It's for a competitor. I'm sorry, guys. But
that's not allowed anymore.
Now that I don't, before I worked for Gene, I wrote for another magazine, and I reviewed the 212, which I haven't posted yet. I got to get that up. But to measure that speaker, I went to Jeff's place and stuck it up on a 6-7 foot. It was actually like a DJ rigging system that's designed for lights and things like that. It's like a 12-inch. It's not called scaffolding. I think the name of it now, but it's basically a big aluminum platform, and it was about 6 or 7 feet tall. And it's designed to handle, I think that one handles like 500 pounds. So like normally we couldn't take a speaker that big and heavy and get it up there. So Jeff and I were like, I'm sure we can lift this thing up. It'll be fine. But anybody who's ever seen the 212 RT knows that speaker itself is about 5.5 feet tall. So the two of us heaved this thing on top, just barely didn't lose it. Like it almost fell right over, which would have been the end of the speaker. I would never do this for another manufacturer, just because, actually, I will never do this for Jeff again. He and I both agreed after we did that was a mistake, and we're never going to do that again. But I'm not going to take the Polk L800s, for instance, and stick those 6-7 feet in the air, because if they do go over, that's the end of the speaker, and that's an expensive speaker to break.
And you could get hurt too.
And yeah, absolutely. That actually was one of our bigger concerns doing it, was we were afraid it was going to fall on us and hurt us, because we have to be there moving it, between measurements. But anyway, we did get it up there, and then we measured it. And so absolutely, I am the only person who has, even Jeff had never done this before. So I'm the only person who has ever accurately captured measurements on a speaker that large before, for a magazine, at least. And I think
I can only imagine the nightmares you have about measuring super large speakers or something like that.
Well, we're always coming up with creative ways to deal with the problems, because even if you have a anechoic chamber, that's one thing. But if you don't have an anechoic chamber, even some of the new special measurement rigs that have been created for doing like near field measurements that can expand that out, those systems can't handle really large towers. They just weren't designed for speakers that big. So even those have to be measured the way we do it, or in an anechoic chamber. And it's just hard to measure in an anechoic chamber. It's expensive. Most people don't live near one. I think the closest one to me is out in Minnesota. So we end up having to come up with these tricks. And the thing is, even manufacturers use these tricks. Polk was telling me that, yes, they have an anechoic chamber, but most of their measurements that they do often are not done in the chamber, just because there's other ways to get accurate measurements. And it's such a pain to set it up and do that. So you kind of use that more for confirmation than you do for all your measurements. And so like with large towers, it's things like laying it on the ground, pointing up at the ceiling and measuring it. I don't
gating your measurements if it's more than 2 meters.
Right. And then you have to figure out where the response is inaccurate. Once you've gated it, there's a certain point where you lose accuracy. And so what you have to do then is use another measurement technique like ground plane, which is accurate at low frequencies, but the highs tend to get all screwed up. So then you can splice them together, but you still tend to get the best data in the mids and highs using a far field approach. So getting that all just so is pretty hard. And then like John Atkinson does all this in his room. And I don't do that because I find it really hard to get that right. He's made a science out of it. I mean, he's gotten good at it. And
you gotta give him credit, because I didn't even realize all of his measurements are done in room, and he's got some really good measurements on speakers on Stereophile.
He does. He apparently, I talked to him one day. We had breakfast, and I was asking him a bit about his kind of history in that, and he told me that he used to measure outside just the way James and I do, and then it just got to be. I mean, one of the problems with measuring outside is it's kind of hard to do in the snow. You can't do it in the rain. You can't do it if it's too windy. Like there's all these weather conditions that affect it. And then when we go measure now speakers, I can measure a speaker in probably an hour. I think James is probably about the same. Setup takes like an hour too, though. But if you're out in the sun for like 3-4 hours, the two of us get burned terrible. And then subs takes us longer to do those tests. And we often do more than one because it takes an hour plus to set up and like an hour. So yeah, we'll just do like 3 or 4 at once. So like we might be out there. He's a trooper. He does it more than I do. So James will be out there for like 8 hours, and often like we'll have to do it when I'm working. And so I'll get him set up in the morning, and then I'll go work. And then if I have a break, I'll run out to help him for a while. And then I come back and work some more. And then at the end of the day, when I'm done with work, I'll run back out, and then we'll spend like, until basically dark finishing it up. And it's just crazy. But it's like the only way to measure it. In fact, for subwoofers, you can't even measure those in an anechoic chamber. The only way to measure those is out in a field like we do.
Yeah, because the anechoic chamber is not big enough to be accurate. Right. There's not enough absorption down to 20 hertz for it to work.
Yeah, well, we should probably do this someday. We should probably talk about how anechoic chambers work. So it's not just the length of the foam wedges that are in there or fiberglass wedges that are in there. It's also the dimensions of the room.
Yeah.
So you have to have both physically large enough, long enough wedges, as well as physically large enough dimensions of the room to be considered valid. And
so you need at least a 50-foot room for 20 hertz, basically.
Yeah, or I think it has. I have to look it up again. There's a formula. I think it has to be a multiple of the full wavelength. Oh, okay. So it's actually bigger than that, I believe. So there are some like that. They're designed for testing like jets and cars. So Paul Barton told me one day that like every once in a while when he wants to confirm something, he might take a couple of his speakers or subs over to one in Canada that's for that, because the NRC is too small too. It's not valid down.
I used to work in anechoic chambers at Raytheon when I designed secure audio systems. We had a giant RF anechoic chamber, just like you're talking about. And I should have brought speakers in there at the time. So last question here. I just want to make this clear because people are maybe not getting the whole point of this whole talk that we did. What if
Yeah.
you stack speakers without flipping them? The problems would be a lot worse.
Exactly.
Talking about.
Yeah. In fact, you were asking me what happens if you like invert the tweeter. Does that make it better? And you could see it just totally canceled out the highs when I did that. I like made it even worse. So what happens then is, so the key is that the shorter the wavelength, the closer the drivers need to be together when you're using multiples in some sort of an array. So tweeters cover very short wavelengths, means they need to be very close together. So if you just put them on top of each other, so you've got like a tweeter here and a tweeter way up here, that spacing is so great that you'll get really big problems from that. So that's like way worse.
So Don says he can't spend more than 5 minutes in anechoic chamber. Don, I kind of feel that same way about you sometimes, man. If I'm around you for too long, I get that same feeling. I got to give him a hard time.
Yeah. Yeah, I've actually built a bunch of soundproof rooms, which is a little different from an anechoic chamber. And I've had a number of situations where the inspectors will come in, and when they're very reflective, but otherwise quiet, they freak out because all they can hear is a very reflective version of like their heartbeat or their own voice. And then opposite, once the room's finished, because they have to do final inspection, and sometimes they'll do that after all the treatments are in, then the room, like my room, the RT60 in my room is like 0.15. It's very low. So when the rooms get to have like very, very little reflections left in them, it's the same kind of thing. It's like an anechoic chamber. You walk in and it's so quiet and so lack of reflections, if you will. It's so unnatural that some people find that uncomfortable to sit in there. And I think because I've been around them for a number of years now, I like it.
I'm sorry. Don's a wise ass. I got to put this up. Dick. Oh my God. Don, you guys know Don Dunn. He's on our channel often. In fact, now that I can't wait to get my second negative test so we can start doing videos again. Don is just awesome to get on our YouTube channel. So I'm looking forward, Don.
So Swain, or the Swain, asked a question that actually is worth covering. So he said, what if you stack electrostatic speakers? So that would be different. That would be okay. And the reason why this would be okay is that would be creating a line array. An electrostatic speaker in general is already a line array, and they're full bandwidth. It's basically like a giant full range speaker, the way many of them are designed. Not always. I know that there's many like the quads that actually had but for the most part, the Acoustats, for instance, excuse me, I believe, unless I don't remember how they were made correctly, the panel itself was essentially like a full range panel. And then what you do is if you stack them, you're making like a full line array. So that's fine. I mean,
I'm trying to figure out mechanically how that would even be possible to do, because the bottom of a electrostat usually has a bass driver. So you're going to have to like bolt it to the ceiling and the floor or something. That'd be kind of weird.
Well, you could flip them, I suppose.
Yeah.
Flip stack. And
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, we're not talking about the ease with which somebody could do this. I don't know how you'd have to probably create like a frame to hold everything together.
So just to recap too, guys, we talked about the flip stacking is generally not a good idea. It's better to design a speaker that's meant to work together with DSP, or just making sure you have optimized driver spacing. The same principle applies for vertical stacking as it does horizontal stacking. If you take two pairs of speakers and put them side by side, I see it all the time. I see people rocking two sets of Vegas on the forums all the time, and they got their woofers moving and they're happy. But you're now creating, instead of a vertical dispersion problem, you're creating a horizontal dispersion or a comb filtering problem. So you go from side to side, and it's going to do the same thing. So
I think people think that it actually creates like a wider sweet spot. It's the exact opposite. You've created a narrower sweet spot.
See, I just said this and someone just asked it. So no, please don't side stack speakers if you could avoid it. And the same thing with the double center channels. And I mean, I would say less is more. Buy better speakers and use less of them. That's really what I would recommend.
Right. Yeah. And the quality of the center doesn't matter in this case. It's just that the tweeters would be way too far apart. So if you think about it, the optimized design would have, if you're going to do two tweeters, would have them very, very close together. They would have to be basically practically touching each other. And what you're now doing is actually placing them very far apart, which is going to cause this really serious interference pattern. And you'll probably get that everywhere.
Now, the only time I would say really to use two center channels, and we're going off topic here, but two center channels works in situations where you have DSP processing like Oro 3D, because they're discrete channels. They're not playing the exact same correlated information. So I think there has to be a distinction there. You're doing different layers of sound. That's different.
Oh,
than
you're
what we're
talking about the different height. Yeah, different height channels
Yeah.
is a different thing. And yeah, you can, I mean, it may be creating some comb filtering, but it's going to be more similar to the types of comb filtering you get from like a left and a right speaker, because they're not sitting on top of each other. They're physically spaced farther apart.
Right.
And then, as you said, they're playing different material. Somebody keeps asking about coaxials. I was thinking about that earlier, and I have a set of coaxials, so I could have measured them, I suppose. My gut tells me that the same problem would arise because the center of the coaxial is where the tweeter basically is, and that constitutes the acoustic center. So I think it would create an interference problem as well. But
yeah, because those two tweeters are going to be still further apart because of the woofers, so you're still having the same problem.
Yeah, but I have some JTR HT 110s, I think they're called, or 110 HTs. They're a 10-inch coaxial. So I could, once the weather clears up again here, I suppose I could try stacking those and seeing what happens.
We could just continue to do all these different combinations of stack speakers until we find one that works, and then you guys can just go nuts and have all the output that you want.
Jeff will love me. He'll just sell a ton of those things. I
think we're wrapped up. We're at the hour mark here. So it was nice, Matt, having you back doing a live stream. This is our first live stream since the whole COVID-19 thing. So I'd like to start doing these again once a week, preferably on the weekends. I prefer to do them, but whatever, it's whatever our schedules work. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please thumb it up. Please subscribe to our channel if you're not already. Don't forget about our Patreon at patreon.com/audioholics. Matt, thank you again for spending an hour with us and doing that slide presentation. And by the way, I will have the slide presentations on Patreon. So if anybody that's a patron member, they can access all of our slide presentations of our live streams if you want to go back and look at that. So I think we are wrapped. Good to see you again, Matt. And until next time, my friends, keep listening.